I'm Esther Dillard on the Black Information Network, chatting with writers and authors who offer an added perspective for our listeners. This is The Color Between the Lines. 1, 2, 3, 4. Police encounters are things we often address here on the Black Information Network. And this week on The Color Between the Lines, we speak with an author who nearly lost his life after a police encounter in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. His name is Leon Ford. Back in 2012, he was shot by an officer 5 times during a traffic stop. It was said to be a case of mistaken identity. The shooting left him without the use of his legs. Since that day, he's become an activist that works with police and community for a change in policing. He even has met with the officer who shot him that day as a means of promoting healing and understanding. The book is called An Unspeakable Hope, Brutality, Forgiveness, and Building a Better Future for My Son. Thank you, Leon Ford, for joining us on the BIN.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be on your platform to share my story.
I tell you, this book, when I first read the first chapter, it was riveting. And I want to get to the part where you're talking, you went and talked to the officer. But before we talk about why you went and talked to this officer, can you explain to our audience what happened to you at 19 years old that day?
Absolutely. So when I was 19 years old, it was November 11th, 2012. I was driving to my grandmother's house for Sunday dinner when I was stopped by 2 police officers. I provided my driver's license, registration, and car insurance. They ran my name. Everything came back clean. Instead of issuing me a citation or letting me go on my way, they decided to tell me that I was lying about my identity and that I was not Leon Ford. Instead, I was Lamont Ford. These officers, threatened me on the side of this road for about 20 minutes. And they decided to go hands-on. I panicked, drove off, and one of the officers jumped inside of my vehicle, shooting me 5 times at point-blank range. I was shot once in my neck, twice in my chest, once in my hip, one in my arm. And one of the bullets that went through my chest actually paralyzed me.
I'm just very, very moved by the entire story then when I read it, all the details, because a lot of times people ask, why do people run from police? And it made me reminded of how much internal things go on when a person is stopped by police. And you put that in very, very clear terms where people can really relate to it. And so I just want to commend you on how you wrote wrote the book and how you try to bring in the audience so that they can really empathize with who you were at that time and then how you've changed over time. It was a very long road to recovery for you physically, but it was clear from the book emotionally and mentally this took a very big toll. I can imagine this was very difficult for you to write because you had to relive the emotional trauma over and over again, was it?
Absolutely. But I will say that going to therapy played a significant role in my healing process and helped me along the journey writing the book. I think, when people read my book, it's kind of like I'm unpacking some of these lived experiences, and I credit therapy for that because while I was writing the book, I was also unpacking a lot of these super traumatic experiences that played a role in how I perceive myself and the world around me.
After that shooting, you became an activist for change. You even met with the officer who shot you. Why did you feel that you needed to do that? And what was that meeting like?
Yeah, so my therapist would tell you that I, I'm someone who loves exposure therapy. But the why behind me meeting the officer who shot me was I was thinking not just about myself, but about community, and I wanted to understand his perspective of why he shot me, because I understood the context of why I was afraid and why I wanted to pull off. And I thought to myself, talking to him without the legalities of our situation, because my attorneys, kind of coached me to frame my story a specific way legally, and I'm sure his attorneys did as well. But talking to one another, we can really figure out a solution to prevent, a young man or woman or police officer from having a horrific experience.
And what did you both determine would have perhaps kept that from happening to someone, or keeps that from happening to someone else?
So there are several different factors that played a role. One, understanding, right? When we understand one another as a community, through relationship building, we can have some type of empathy for why someone may perceive us a specific way. From my perspective, sharing my lived experience with police officers, they get to understand why I didn't trust police officers. They get to understand why I actually felt afraid from these police officers that night I was shot. And then hearing his perspective, their, his lived experience plays a role. Training plays a role, and the disconnect between police and community played a huge role as well. And this is why, as a solution, the Here Foundation, which is a foundation that I co-founded with the former chief of police here in Pittsburgh, is really, really focused on building meaningful relationships between police and community, so that every encounter that a resident may have with a police officer isn't, a traumatic experience.
Do you think that also, in addition to that, and I'm just thinking in terms of what you just said, that if there are more police officers that actually live in the neighborhoods that they patrol, then they would have known who you were and perhaps would not have even bothered you once they saw your license?
Absolutely, right? And then the other side of that is, if there were more people from the community who wanted to become police officers to patrol their own community, that would have played a difference. And when I go out and I mentor young people, and I ask them if they would ever become a police officer, they're like, heck no, I would never become a cop, And then I would ask them, well, if you were the officer that pulled me over the night I was shot, do you think I would be in a wheelchair? And their perspective completely shifts. And the other thing that I do is I expose them to the several different jobs within law enforcement that exist. So there's you could be so much more than a police officer to add value to public safety.
Mm. For those of you who are just joining us, I'm Esther Dillard on the Black Information Network, and I'm talking with the author and activist Leon Ford about his book called An Unspeakable Hope: Brutality, Forgiveness, and Building a Better Future for My Son. Your activism goes beyond just police reform, but addressing mental health. And I like the fact that you address that often teens and kids experience trauma and it isn't properly addressed. You kind of gave an example of that when you talked about your sister. You lost your sister when she was young from an accident, and it wasn't addressed with therapy, but then your grades dropped that year, and no one who just looked at the transcripts would put two and two together unless they factored in mental health. Can you speak why mental health has become such an important part of your activism?
Yeah, so when I think about my upbringing, and to go back to my memoir, An Unspeakable Hope, I shared the night that I was shot, but in the following chapter, I talk about my first time going to a funeral, and that experience was the first time I remember suppressing my emotions. And so I believe that mental health is such an important conversation for us to have, because we've been exposed to conditions that are not normal. We normalize this trauma, and then you have generations of people who have experienced astronomical amount of loss and grief that they have not dealt with. And so when I look at my parents, or when I look at my grandparents, and I talk to them about their lived experiences and the deaths and from their friends and our loved ones, and they've never talked to anybody. Even my grandparents and my parents' experience with racism. These are things that they just kind of said, well, this is the way things go, and you just got to get over it, and we got to push through it, and we can't cry, and we can't complain.
Right.
And so I don't think talking about it is complaining, especially when you're seeking to heal. And so I feel like as Black people, we it's interesting on a national level. I think people want us to have this woe is me mentality, but everyday Black folks, like, these are some resilient people who have experienced some traumas that we quite don't understand. And when we encourage one another to heal, when we can have compassion and understanding for one another, then we can heal as a community. And as a result of the brokenness within our community, we see the different mental health challenges, we see the violence, we see the destruction of family. And so I believe that it's very important for us to talk about mental health, to encourage one another to heal in ways that we can be productive, family members, but also productive members of society.
In one interview I read, you said that you weren't happy with those who called you the, quote, perfect victim. Can you explain why that upset you so much?
Yeah, I believe this, idea of the perfect victim says that if you're not perfect, you don't deserve justice. And we saw it with, Mike Brown, and, the context of maybe he stole something from a store, or with George Floyd, that there may have been some drug usage in the past. And I say to that, it doesn't matter. They didn't deserve to die. And unfortunately, Black lives, we have to prove that we're worthy of humanity. That's so unfair. And so I believe that there are some, leaders within the movement that perpetuates this idea of the perfect victim by only supporting those people who they deem are perfect, or trying to frame people from the lens of perfection. And then, once the media get a hold of one minor infraction, they got suspended from school in the 7th grade, then all of a sudden they don't deserve justice.
Right. I love it. What do you want? There are so many points in this book that we couldn't cover them all because you want people to actually pick it up and read it. What do you want readers to come away with after reading this book?
I believe in Unspeakable Hope is for anyone who has undergone traumatic life experiences and came out on the other side, but it's also for people who are going through those experiences, trying to figure out what's next, trying to figure out what the possibilities are. So I hope that people find the value of family, the significance of hope and inspiration when they read in Unspeakable Hope.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Leon Ford, for joining us on the BIN.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
That's it for this edition of The Color Between the Lines. The book is called An Unspeakable Hope, Brutality, Forgiveness, and Building a Better Future for My Son. I'm Esther Dillard on the Black Information Network.